The room fell silent. The air was thick with a tension that no words could cut through. Across the polished floor, a man in a crisp uniform, decorated with the marks of a war that had scarred a continent, stepped forward. The eyes of the soldiers and journalists alike were fixed on him, yet all attention gravitated toward the other figure in the room, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, a man whose decisions had shaped the course of history and whose judgment had carried the weight of thousands of lives. The German general extended his hand, a gesture that, under ordinary circumstances, would have been a routine courtesy, a symbol of formal respect. But this was no ordinary moment. Every eye watched, every heartbeat seemed to pause. And then, with a deliberate calm, Eisenhower did something that would be remembered as much for its silence as any victory in battle. He refused to shake the general's hand. It wasn't anger that fueled the refusal, nor petty revenge. It was principle, a statement carved from the grim realities of a war that had consumed millions and shattered civilizations. In that single silent motion, Eisenhower spoke louder than words ever could. Some acts cannot be forgiven and some alliances cannot be acknowledged. The story behind this refusal is not merely about two men meeting in a room. It is about the collision of duty, morality, and the haunting shadows of history. It is about a moment when the weight of conscience outweighed the etiquette of command, and when a gesture, or the absence of one, echoed across the annals of time. By early 1945, Europe was a continent in ruins. Cities lay in smoldering heaps, their streets littered with debris and the echoes of suffering. Millions had been uprooted, countless lives extinguished, and yet the war was not yet truly over. Adolf Hitler's Reich was collapsing, but remnants of his military, steeped in discipline and pride, still posed challenges. Among them was a cadre of generals who had survived the firestorms of battle, men whose names would forever be entwined with the machinery of war. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had borne the enormous weight of responsibility throughout this conflict. He had coordinated armies from multiple nations, navigated political tensions among leaders like Churchill and de Gaulle, and faced the constant moral dilemmas that accompanied victory and conquest. Yet, for all his strategic brilliance, Eisenhower remained a man of principle. He understood that winning a war was more than securing territory or forcing surrenders. It was about restoring humanity to a continent that had nearly lost it entirely. The German general who approached Eisenhower on that fateful day was not just any officer. He represented the elite, the embodiment of a military system that had orchestrated campaigns marked by ruthlessness and efficiency. His reputation preceded him, a tactician capable of brilliance on the battlefield, yet a participant in atrocities that stained history. While his uniform bore medals and insignia denoting service, each ribbon and stripe carried the shadow of countless civilians caught in the gears of war. The meeting was arranged in a secure, understated room, a space devoid of ceremony, yet heavy with symbolic weight. Eisenhower, aware of the cameras and witnesses documenting every gesture, approached the encounter with deliberate calm. His mind, however, churned beneath the surface. Each decision he had made in the war, every strategy approved or denied, every choice to press forward or hold back, had led to this very moment. The German general, trained in the rituals of military diplomacy, extended his hand as the room collectively held its breath. To many, it seemed a mere formality, a gesture to mark the end of hostilities. To Eisenhower it was more complicated. The war had been fought not just with guns and tanks but with ideology, a belief system that had justified murder, oppression, and unspeakable cruelty. In shaking the hand of this man, Eisenhower would have been acknowledging not just a surrender, but a moral equivalence that he could not accept. There was silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes, that hangs in the air like a palpable presence. Witnesses later described the moment as tense, as if the room itself waited for a verdict. Eisenhower's eyes did not waver. His posture remained upright, composed, authoritative. Then, with understated finality, he stepped back. The hand remained unshaken. It was not a moment of theatrics or personal animosity, it was a conscious statement. In that refusal lay the weight of accountability, the unspoken message that some actions leave marks that cannot be erased with a handshake. Eisenhower had always believed that leadership demanded a balance between pragmatism and morality. He was not a man who sought vengeance. Indeed, his approach during the war often favored measured responses and careful strategy over emotion. Yet, he also understood that morality had a place in leadership. He had seen the horrors of concentration camps firsthand. The images of emaciated prisoners, the meticulous records of industrialized murder, and the human suffering inflicted by the Nazi regime were not abstractions to him, They were real, visceral, and unforgettable. Any notion of cordiality toward the architects of such suffering would have been a betrayal of the values he fought to uphold. By refusing to shake the German general's hand, Eisenhower was drawing a line. Diplomacy and etiquette, while important in some contexts, could not override the fundamental responsibility of judgment. Some acts, he understood, demanded moral clarity, and there could be no compromise. From the German general's perspective, the moment must have been jarring. Conditioned to the rituals of military hierarchy, he expected the handshake as a standard acknowledgement of the surrender. To be refused, particularly by a man of Eisenhower's stature, would have been both personal and emblematic. Yet, the general was no naive participant in this drama. He was fully aware of the consequences of the war he had helped wage. He understood that actions, even those executed under orders, carried moral weight, and that the Allied leadership would measure not just victory but justice. Still, in the immediate moment, the refusal must have felt like a judgment passed silently, without words, without debate, and without negotiation. The room's witnesses, including journalists and military aides, later described the scene as one of profound gravity. It was a rare instance where a single gesture, or its absence, communicated more than any speech or treaty. Eisenhower's career had been defined by careful calculation, strategy, and a deep understanding of human nature. Yet the war had tested him in ways that no military academy could prepare a man for. The moral dilemmas he faced were immense. How to end a conflict efficiently without compromising the humanity of the victors, how to balance vengeance with justice, and how to reconcile the demands of political leaders with the needs of ordinary soldiers and civilians. In the aftermath of Nazi Germany's collapse, these dilemmas became intensely personal. The liberation of concentration camps had left Eisenhower with an indelible impression of the horrors humanity was capable of inflicting. For him, victory was not merely about flags raised or territories captured. It was about ensuring that the instruments of oppression could never again threaten civilization. He understood the delicate dance of power in these final moments. Allied leaders, including Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Joseph Stalin, had their own perspectives on the treatment of German officers and officials. Some favored pragmatic reconciliation, emphasizing stability and rebuilding. Others pressed for accountability and public demonstrations of justice. Eisenhower had to navigate these competing pressures while remaining true to his own principles. The refusal to shake the German general's hand was thus more than a personal statement. It was a deliberate act of leadership. It sent a clear message to the world that moral clarity would guide the Allies' treatment of defeated leaders, and that atrocities could not be glossed over by protocol or ceremony. History is often shaped by monumental battles and sweeping strategies, but sometimes it is defined by fleeting, almost imperceptible moments. Eisenhower's refusal was one such moment. In that instant, he made a moral decision that transcended politics, rank, and military etiquette. The act was symbolic yet profoundly powerful. By declining the handshake, Eisenhower drew an invisible line between military professionalism and complicity in crimes against humanity. It reminded everyone present that surrender did not erase guilt, and that formal gestures of civility could not undo the human suffering inflicted over 6 years of relentless warfare. Observers noted that Eisenhower's calm composure contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He did not flinch, scowl, or deliver a dramatic speech. The power of the moment lay in its silence, in the absence of action that spoke louder than any words. This restraint underscored his mastery of leadership, the ability to assert authority and moral judgment without resorting to theatrics. The refusal did not go unnoticed. Allied aides and journalists documented the encounter, and soon the story circulated widely. It became a defining anecdote of Eisenhower's tenure as Supreme Commander, a reminder that true leadership often requires making difficult choices that may be unpopular, uncomfortable, or misunderstood at first. Reactions varied. Some admired Eisenhower for his steadfast moral compass, seeing the refusal as an ethical stand in the face of overwhelming pressure. Others questioned whether such a gesture was necessary, suggesting that reconciliation and diplomacy might have served a more practical purpose in post-war reconstruction. Yet, over time, the historical consensus has come to view the decision as emblematic of Eisenhower's integrity. Even within the German military ranks, the incident resonated. Officers who had been steeped in the formalities of command and ceremony were confronted with a new paradigm. Accountability and morality could outweigh ritual, and history would judge actions more than appearances. Beyond strategy and symbolism, the refusal also speaks to the human dimension of leadership. Eisenhower had long believed that true authority comes not from titles or medals, but from the ability to act with conscience. By refusing the handshake, he demonstrated empathy for the millions who had suffered under Nazi rule and reinforced the principle that power carries moral responsibility. In personal reflections and later memoirs, Eisenhower acknowledged the burden of such decisions. Leadership, he wrote, requires the courage to make choices that are morally defensible, even if they risk criticism or misunderstanding. The handshake, he believed, would have been a betrayal not of personal animosity, but of the very ideals he had fought to protect: justice, dignity, and the preservation of human life. The significance of this single act extends beyond the immediate context of World War II. It set a precedent for post-war military and diplomatic interactions, illustrating that ceremonial gestures are not morally neutral. By choosing principle over formality, Eisenhower left a lesson for future generations of leaders: that actions must reflect ethics, and that symbols carry weight that can influence history as much as battles or treaties. Historians have since noted that moments like these are rarely recorded in textbooks alongside military strategies, yet they shape collective memory. The refusal was not about humiliation or spectacle. It was a deliberate moral choice, a statement that some wrongs demand acknowledgement and cannot be erased by protocol. In the quiet aftermath of that encounter, the room seemed to hold its breath a little longer, as if aware of the magnitude of what had just occurred. Eisenhower's refusal to shake the German general's hand was a silent verdict, a gesture, or more precisely the absence of one, that reverberated far beyond the confines of that small, austere room. It was a lesson in restraint, in the power of subtlety, and in the undeniable weight of conscience. In a world consumed by the machinery of war, where violence had often spoken louder than words, Eisenhower's silence was a roar. It proclaimed to everyone present, and to history itself, that some acts are beyond forgiveness, that the human cost of evil cannot be smoothed over by politeness, and that morality must sometimes override ritual. This refusal was not impulsive, nor was it driven by personal bitterness. Eisenhower was a man of careful thought and measured action. Every decision he had made throughout the war had been filtered through layers of strategy, politics, and human consideration. Yet here he made a choice that transcended pragmatism. He made a choice that belonged to conscience alone. The German general, standing before him, was a figure of competence, experience, and tactical skill, but also of complicity in a system that had orchestrated unimaginable suffering. By refusing the handshake, Eisenhower drew a clear line: the surrender of armies does not absolve the sins of leadership, and decorum cannot replace accountability. It was a moment that transformed the ordinary act of greeting into a profound moral statement. Observers of that scene later reflected on its intensity. Some were initially perplexed, wondering why a simple gesture had been denied. But with time, it became apparent that the refusal carried a resonance unmatched by any speech or proclamation. Historians have argued that it symbolized the ethical dimension of victory, reminding the world that leadership is not merely about strategy, force, or success. It is about responsibility, judgment, and integrity. Eisenhower's career, already marked by brilliance in planning and execution, was defined as much by his moral decisions as by his tactical victories. The handshake incident encapsulated a principle that guided him throughout the war: that actions must honor the greater good, even when the moment presents opportunities for ease or diplomacy. He understood that true leadership demands courage not only on the battlefield but also in moments of personal choice, when the right decision may come at the cost of comfort or convention. It is worth imagining that moment in vivid detail. The general's hand extended, a conventional gesture of courtesy, met with silence instead of warmth. The room's atmosphere shifted. Every observer sensed that history was being written in an instant. It was a collision of worlds: the meticulous formality of military tradition versus the unyielding demands of justice. Eisenhower did not flinch. He did not hesitate. He stepped back and, in doing so, declared the supremacy of principle over protocol. This act continues to echo through history because it transcends its immediate context. It reminds us that leadership is inseparable from morality, that power carries the weight of responsibility, and that the ethical dimension of action cannot be overlooked. In an era where gestures can be superficial, Eisenhower's refusal demonstrates the potency of restraint and the profound impact of silent assertion. Beyond the immediate political and military consequences, the refusal had symbolic significance for the world emerging from war. Europe faced the daunting task of reconstruction, reconciliation, and the restoration of human dignity. Eisenhower's choice underscored the necessity of accountability. A society cannot rebuild on the ashes of injustice without first acknowledging and confronting the wrongs that created them. The message was clear: justice must precede reconciliation, and ethical clarity must guide governance and leadership. Moreover, the incident invites reflection on the human capacity for moral courage. In times of chaos and conflict, when the demands of expediency and the pressures of circumstance urge compromise, true leaders must sometimes act against expectation, against ease, and even against custom. Eisenhower's refusal was a manifestation of that courage, a quiet yet unyielding assertion of principle that resonates as much today as it did in 1945. The lesson extends beyond military contexts. In diplomacy, in governance, in personal and professional life, there are moments when the simplest actions, or inactions, carry profound ethical weight. Choosing what is right, even when uncomfortable, is the measure of integrity. Eisenhower's refusal exemplifies this lesson in stark relief. History remembers not only the victories won on battlefields but also the moral decisions made in their shadows. As time passes and the faces of generals, politicians, and soldiers fade into history, the moment remains vivid. The story of that handshake, or its deliberate absence, is retold not merely to recount an anecdote, but to highlight the enduring importance of principle in leadership. It is a reminder that moral courage, like strategic brilliance, shapes the course of events and leaves an indelible mark on history. Ultimately, Eisenhower's action teaches that justice, conscience, and human decency are inseparable from effective leadership. The refusal to shake hands with a defeated general was not an act of vengeance. It was an assertion of values, a statement that some wrongs demand recognition and that some boundaries cannot be crossed. It is a story of dignity, restraint, and the profound impact of ethical choice. In that quiet, tense moment, Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke louder than any speech, louder than any command, louder than the roar of battle itself. And in that silence, the world was reminded that true leadership is defined not only by what one does, but by what one refuses to do. The handshake was never given. The lesson, however, endures.